Okay, everyone, welcome to my first ever stream. My name is Julian, and for this channel I want to bring you guys some good content. So it's going to be tech related. I'm going to bring you guys some gameplay footage, some benchmarking of some games. I'm going to do some reviews, whether it be on controllers, computer hardware, overclocking, you name it. That's the type of content that I want to bring you guys. My current system is an RTX 3080. It's overclocked to 50 megahertz on the core clock. The processor is an Intel i9-10900K. I'm running 32 gigabytes of RAM at 3700 megahertz CL15 latency. And in the top left corner here, you can see my current FPS. And then you can also see the dedicated VRAM and the allocated VRAM. So the RTX 3080 has 10 gigs of VRAM. Not really coming anywhere close to that. But I am running Nvidia broadcast, so my FPS is usually higher than that. And then I'm also running OBS, so when you have those two systems working together, it kind of takes a frame hit. But for my first ever video stream, I want to do a general performance test with my settings on Modified Ultra, and I'll show you guys the settings at the end of the stream. But I want to show you guys performance in the cockpit of an airliner in Microsoft Flight Simulator, and one that tends to use up a lot of frames. So I'm in the FlyByWire A320neo, and those guys have done a phenomenal job. It makes me not want to fly the regular Airbus. Once you go fly their Airbus, you really can't go back. But it does use up more frames than a basic Airbus. So I've seen people flying in the regular Airbus, but in the FlyByWire Airbus, it eats up a lot more frames. So I wanted to do a performance test in here to give you guys an idea of what you can expect out of some of the newer hardware gaming at 4K. This is 3840 by 2160, gaming at that resolution on a more sophisticated, complicated airliner with the glass cockpit and everything like that, with the cockpit refresh rate set on medium and not low. I am going to go ahead and disable the Nvidia broadcast before we take off, just so you guys can get a more realistic picture of what your frame rate will be like. Okay guys, so here we are. Again, we're just going to do a quick flight here showing you the performance of the RTX 3080 inside of the FlyByWire A320neo. And I think my next video, I will do a video showing the performance difference between the FlyByWire A320neo and the default one, just so that you guys can see how resource intensive it is in the sim. But again, if you haven't used it, then you guys don't know what you're missing out on. The FlyByWire A320neo is worth the performance, and it's not that bad. As you can see, I'm still getting good performance. I know a lot of you guys are upset that current hardware can't get 60 FPS in a flight simulator, but that has always been the case. So in my opinion, the sim is not poorly optimized. If you go back to X-Plane, even the current one, X-Plane 11, X-Plane 10, if you go back to old flight simulators, they were always built to be future-proof. And the hardware that came out right around the same time as the sim released was never actually able to run it at a full 60 FPS. In my opinion, this is actually the best performance I've gotten out of modern hardware in a sim running all of this. We have the terrain LOD all the way out to 200. Pretty much everything is on Ultra with the exception of a few things, and I will show you those settings after we finish the flight. Alright, so like I said, not going to do it by the book. At least not fully by the book. I'm not going to fly like a madman, but I'm just trying to show you guys the performance. We are flying out of a large airport with some of the handcrafted buildings. This is Payware add-on. We are flying out of Chicago O'Hare, and as you can see, we are getting pretty good FPS there, staying above 30, which is really what you want in flight sims. There are some setting tweaks that can also be done to improve performance as well in the sim. Because believe it or not, a lot of the settings actually give you diminishing returns in both performance and visual eye candy, visual improvement. So one of the things that I have turned down, and again I'll show you guys the settings, I am playing at 4K, but one of the things that I have turned down is shadows. Shadows are not on ultra, shadows are on high. Because what I find is that the visual difference is negligible, but the performance degradation is noticeable, especially when flying through, like, let's say, overcast or rainy conditions or anything like that. Go ahead and give you guys a look around. As you can see, maintaining solid FPS in a major area. Let me change the time of day for you guys. See the ground sending a little bit. As you can see, holding 50 outside the cockpit. Drop down to the 40s and 45s inside. So about a 5 to 10 FPS difference depending on what it is that you're looking at. And that has a lot to do with the cockpit, the glass cockpits inside of the sim. So I have my refresh rate set from high to medium. That's another performance tip as well. If you have that glass cockpit refresh rate set to high, it's going to have a major impact on your CPU. So setting the refresh rate actually lowers
Chicago
the
approach Delta Airlines 320, 5,400 feet.
I believe that's actually one of the reasons why the FlyByWire A320 is more performance intensive than the default one, because it has a lot more complex systems, and therefore you have a lot more things that are working on the glass cockpits than the default one. Some people have seen improvements or reported that they've seen improvements by turning off the screens on the first officer side, so we'll do that just to see if we notice a difference. So we'll do that, see if we notice a difference inside the cockpit. I would say a few frames maybe, but that could just be placebo. Just where we're flying, things are changing, so I'm not really sure if I would count that as an improvement. If so, it's not really noticeable. And the photogrammetry in this game is done very well. That's a nice one. Take a look at downtown Chicago. Parts of the sim. Show you guys what the frame rate is on landing. The frame rate always drops when landing into one of your bigger airports. I am planning on an NVME M.2 drive to help with loading in some of the scenery. You'll notice in this game that when you're flying, if you don't have a fast enough hard drive, the scenery tends to load in slower, and that can give you micro stutters in the game, which, in my opinion, can ruin the immersion. Start dropping the flaps.
119.0 Delta Airlines 320.
Drop the gear.
Chicago approach Delta Airlines 320
500.
And again, just a beautiful scene. Another thing that I've noticed in the sim is that rolling cache and manual cache doesn't seem to make that much of a difference. I could be wrong. I am planning on gigabit internet, but with everyone in my house using it all the time, I'm usually only maxing out at about 300 or 400 megabytes per second download speed. So not really getting the full use of the gigabit, and that's optimal. Sometimes I'm getting 200. 150 to 200, depending on how much bandwidth is being used up in the house. But I find that rolling cache for me hasn't made a difference. I don't know, notice any more or less stutters. I will say with the latest update, personally for me, the stutters have not been as noticeable. It does stutter a little bit when coming on land, and you guys can start to see now that our frames are dropping a little bit. So we were in the mid 40s, now we're dropping down to the high to mid 30s. Still very, very playable. I am on a G-Sync monitor as well, so that helps with smoothness. For flight sims, I would say aim for 25 to 30 FPS. That's going to give you a pretty decent flying experience. When you're playing games that aren't really moving that fast, you're not really going to notice any input lag or any difference. Another thing, I'm flying with the Thrustmasters T1600 yoke and throttle. The yoke very much resembles the yoke that you would see inside of the Airbus A320. They do have one that I believe is the Airbus A320 First Officer Edition. I want to get that one, but with the supply chain being impaired due to the circumstances that are going on right now, it is very, very hard to get your hands on certain things, whether it be GPUs, CPUs, next-gen consoles. I've even seen desks completely sold out online. But flight yokes have also been hard to come by. A lot of stuff has been hard to come by, especially when you combine the constraints on the supply chain with more people staying at home more than ever. So that's what it is. And you guys can see approaching the airport, we drop down to the low 30s when coming in. So landing at these major airports always yields a massive performance.
50, 40, 30, 20, retard.
Ooh, that's a hard landing.
Retard.
That is a hard landing.
Retard.
Just trying to give you guys that good bounce. Anyway, full throttle. I mean, I was trying to give you guys that wing view. So we'll make sure the next landing is more of a greaser and not as heavy. So I'm going to drop the terrain LOD down to 100, and you will see that the visual difference, it still visually looks good. So to me, that's an area where you guys can increase some performance in this game. So if you're having trouble maintaining a smooth frame rate or a decent frame rate, turning this terrain level of detail down will also help you out. But now we're in the menu. I'll go ahead and let you guys take a look at some of my modified settings that I was touching on before. VSync is virtually broken in the sim, so just leave that off. But again, mostly everything on Ultra with the exception of volumetric clouds. And again, that's because when they're on Ultra, it hits my GPU a little too hard, and I don't notice that much of a visual difference. So everything else is on Ultra. I noticed that these two settings really don't impact my GPU that much. Maybe if you're on a lower end GPU, it might. I would say play around with it. This pretty much increases the crispiness of the runway. These two, that's what I've noticed for the most part. Haven't really noticed a visual difference adjusting these settings anywhere else than when I'm sitting on the runway. Texture synthesis set to ultra, water waves are at high, shadow maps are one notch down from ultra, same thing with terrain shadows. Contact shadows, ambient occlusion, contact shadows and windows effects, windshield effects are on ultra. Ambient occlusion is on high instead of ultra, and that's another one where I don't notice that much of a visual improvement, but the performance degradation is noticeable, so I leave that one on high instead of ultra. Depth of field, this is just personal preference. I like mine on medium. Motion blur, again, don't like it on ultra. I like mine on high. You could put it on ultra if you wanted to, but personally I like mine there. Lens correction just doesn't seem it's weird. I don't want the sim controlling my camera for me in any way, so I leave that off. And then lens flare, this is actually supposed to be off because that's just not a realistic look in my opinion. And glass cockpit refresh rate is set to medium instead of high. High tends to kill the frames too much. Medium is still very smooth and very flyable in my opinion. So these are some of those settings. We'll go over to traffic. Traffic is off. Airport life, vehicle density is pretty low. Ground aircraft density, I have that fairly low because I'm more concerned about a smoother planning experience rather than having a populated airport. And then worker density, I also have that fairly low. Not really too concerned with them. You can turn this up if you want to, but these are my settings. Land and sea traffic, same thing. I'm not really paying attention to the leisure boats. I still want to have some because it's nice to see a few boats parked. Even though these settings seem low, I actually have more traffic pop up in these regions than you would expect for it being this low. And then road vehicles, I have it set to 30. I haven't noticed a difference between 50 and 30, but because I also visually don't see a difference between 50 and 30, and I would assume that 50 would eat up more of the CPU than 30, I have it set to 30, because visually I don't see a difference between 50 and 30. And so those are my traffic settings. So I will go ahead and exit back. Let me just make sure. Yep, so I will show you guys the performance difference landing in a major airport with the terrain LOD at 100, and we can also see the visual changes as well. But visually, you can see that with the terrain LOD set on 100, the road is still very well populated. You still get a ton of photogrammetry. 200 does extend out further, but for me, visually, I don't notice that much of a difference to when me losing 10 to 12 FPS.
Continuous plan.
Let me go ahead and change
Altimeter 29.66.
time of day again. Get a better look. Better look around. You can even see in the cockpit we're in the 50s instead of the 40s. And it still gives you a very dense look with the terrain LOD at 100. So personally, that's one thing that I've been against on performance back. That, again, in my opinion, visually, I hardly notice. Of course, if I switch it back and forth, I'm going to notice it, but I hardly notice. And then another thing, guys, once you get those settings down, you'll find that the sim actually flies much smoother than you think it is. So if you turn the FPS counter off, and I'm only doing this just to give you guys a performance. If you turn the FPS counter off, you'll realize that you don't even notice how fast, you don't even notice the difference in like 50 versus 40 or something like that. So the sim is actually very, very smooth. Very, very smooth. Let's see, we're getting 54 here this time. And again, just a very convincing scene. Very convincing scene. You can see some of those boats popping in and out. Head back. You guys a nighttime landing. Show you what the sun looks like midnight. Very nice. Oh, you can see the stadium. Alright, let's start slowing down. Slowing down and reducing our altitude. So those speed brakes out so we can start slowing down. Flaps 1.
Delta Airlines 320 contact Chicago approach on 119.0.
Drop the gear down and add some drag.
119.0 Delta Airlines 320. Chicago approach Delta Airlines 320, 4,900 feet.
The sounds when you go from the cockpit to
Delta Airlines 320 Chicago approach. Continuous plan.
Anyway, we were very high, so we are going to pitch the nose down and keep the speed brakes out so we don't gain too much speed while dropping the nose down to increase our descent. We are fairly high, but we can still make this landing. But as you can see, our frames are still in the mid-40s. We're getting closer to the airport, and remember when we landed with the terrain LOD fully maxed out at 200, the FPS was to the low 30s. At some point it was actually dead on at 30. But I just want you guys to pay attention to the FPS difference now when getting closer to the airport. Settings were not proper, so we set that to 290.66. So we're actually lower than that said we were. But look at that, so far we're still in the 40s.
1,000.
Low 30s, so it's kind of fluctuating around, and those spikes tend to happen as the scenery is loading in more of the scenery, whether it be from your internet or from your cache. But I mean, 10 FPS for something that doesn't make that much of a visual difference. And you can see we're still holding 40.
500.
In my opinion, keep the terrain LOD at 100. I don't turn it up anymore.
400. 400. 300. 200.
The first landing was a mean, ugly bounce, so let's see if I can give you guys a much smoother landing this time. I'll make this one a greaser.
50. 40. 30. 20. Retard. Retard.
Kill the throttles. Nice flare. Floating a little bit. Nice. So much better touchdown. And as you can see, the frame rate is still in the high 40s. I mean, in the low 40s, high 30s. Much different from that 30 that we had when we touched down. Okay. So I will go ahead and taxi down. Taxi all the way down, and then we will take off one more time, and I will show you the performance when we have weather involved. So, I mean, for a major airport, we are at Chicago to be getting 40-45 FPS inside the cockpit. It's still very, very good. 32 gigabytes of RAM, and we're only using 16 gigabytes right now. But let's go ahead and add some weather in. So let's do something intense. Let's add some rain to the sound. Let you guys take a look at the performance in there. So we got a little bit of rain. Thinking if we fly a little more, we'll see more performance. Maybe we adjust the time of day a little bit. That looks nice. Okay, and this will be the last one. So, Saratoga, flaps 2. Speed at 250. That looks. Very convincing scene. I think we will actually fly over the clouds in this one. Let's go back to the cockpit. 140. Consider V1. Look at that wing flex.
Too low, terrain. Too low, terrain. Too low, terrain.
Nice.
Too low, terrain. Too low, terrain. Chicago approach Delta Airlines 320 is Type Airbus A320 and 1 mile southeast of O'Hare 700 feet. Request clearance to transition Bravo airspace.
Really good performance. However,
Delta Airlines 320.
if I go and I change these settings and I turn the clouds up to ultra, you will notice that visually you don't see that much of a difference. However, the performance does take a hit.
0 Chicago approach.
So as you can see, we're down,
0646.
especially outside the cockpit.
Squawk 0646 Delta Airlines 320.
Dipping low into the 20s.
Delta Airlines 320 radar contact 3 miles east of
And I'm
O'Hare
wondering if that has to do
2,400
with
feet.
the VRAM
Clear through
being
the Bravo
maxed out. So if
airspace.
you combine the dedicated and the allocated, then you technically
Cleared
are
through the
over
Bravo
10,
airspace
but
Delta Airlines
not really sure
320.
how much allocated VRAM actually impacts performance. But if we go back and we turn this back down from ultra to high, you will notice that we get a lot of those frames back, and visually at no cost. So clouds look the same. However, you see now we're getting 40 FPS. So that's also something you can do to improve performance in the sim as well. And I guess I was wrong about the whole allocated VRAM thing, because as you can see, it's still the exact same. So it must just be utilizing the GPU. That's where performance is. That's very, very nice. And hopefully this video provides you with a much smoother flying experience in Microsoft Flight Simulator, because that is my goal.
Delta Airlines 320, contact Chicago approach on 128.2.
Lines 320, 6,200
Just
feet.
very nice. Those clouds.
Delta Airlines 320, Chicago approach, continuous planned. Altimeter 29.902.
Down the back.
Squad 5744 Delta Airlines
Now you
320.
can see we're in the high 50s.
Delta
Low
Airlines
50s.
320, radar
mid
contact
40s.
14 miles northeast of Midway 11,100
Outside,
feet.
you see we're in
Altimeter
the low 40s
29.902.
instead of the mid 30s. And
Copy Delta
visually,
Airlines
the clouds
320.
the same.
Cleared through the Bravo airspace.
Clear through
Speed
Bravo
limit
airspace
starts
Delta Airlines
slowing down.
320.
And that is Chicago Midway Airport out to our left. The window there.
Delta Airlines 320. Chicago approach Delta Airlines 320, 6,700 feet.
Delta Airlines 320, Chicago approach, continuous planned.
So as you can see now, passing through the clouds, because we have them set to high instead of ultra, we don't get any performance hit when passing through the clouds. Jump back in the cockpit. That VFR map out. Drop the gear down and add some drag. Once we get flaps, when this thing really starts slowing down. It's the time I want to do it. There we go. Once you guys see those lights. Alright, we get back to flying this baby.
2,500. 500. 500. 400. 300. 300. 300. 100.
Been an interesting landing. The wind and everything.
50, 40, 30, 20, retard, retard,
Jump a little
retard, retard,
We're floating.
5,
Also, my Nvidia inspector settings are modified a little as well. So, texture quality is set to high performance, and power settings are set to prefer maximum performance. Everything else is recommended settings untouched. And that's just and then next time we're not doing a performance test, I'll actually do an actual flight where we'll start up at the gate, cold and dark. We'll follow a route plan and do all that. I play a lot of air haulers, so I'll have that up on one of the next streams. So okay, APU should be available, and it is. Kill the engines. Show you those sounds in the cockpit. I mean, in the cabin of the engine shutting down. Which is very nice. But anyway, guys, that is going to wrap up this stream. Thank you for tuning in. Just to recap on a few things in terms of performance, just to recap on some things that you can do to improve the performance. Make sure you turn the terrain LOD down to 100. I don't recommend turning it above that unless you have a system that can run it. Make sure that you turn down the quality of the clouds from ultra to high. I find that the visual difference is negligible. Even running it on medium still looks very, very good, and you'll gain a whole lot of performance there, especially if your GPU bottlenecks. Ambient occlusion, you can turn that down. I've turned it all the way down to medium, and still the ambient occlusion on medium looks really, really nice when my system can run it at high, so I leave it there. Turn down the traffic. Make sure you are using generic traffic models if you do have it on, especially if you're playing on multiplayer. And other than that, just don't pay attention to the FPS counter. Go out there, fly, and have fun. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Don't forget to ring that bell. I'm new, I'm starting out. I'm excited to bring you guys content. And as the channel grows, the things that I'm going to add, the content, and all of that stuff is going to grow as well. So we can grow together. Until next time.